Challenging the old world order. 5 emerging economies wanted to financially take on the West. But has BRICS been a success or is it doomed to failure? This is Roundtable with me, David Foster. An alliance of developing nations, Brazil, Russia, China, India and South Africa. Some thought perhaps were too disparate to come together as any kind of collective force. The question is, are they right in thinking that? Are the BRICS countries finding it hard to focus on what the common goal is? Or can they still make a difference in the global economy? An alliance to rival the G7. The BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, have a common goal to challenge the economic supremacy of the West, confronting its neoliberal structures and offering an alternative development bank.
应该深化在重大问题上的沟通和协调，推动建立更加公正合理的国际秩序。
Is BRICS an effective counter to the IMF and World Bank, or with its nations experiencing varying degrees of turbulence and reports of rivalry and clashes, is it losing focus? In 2001, Goldman Sachs predicted that a group of developing and newly industrialized countries could emerge as a dominant world force. BRICS was formed in 2006. Its countries make up 40% of the global population and nearly 1/4 of the world's gross domestic product.
БРИКС занимает уникальное место в глобальной экономике. Это самый большой рынок в мире.
China is the world's second largest economy after the US. India has 6 out of the 30 fastest growing cities in the world, and South Africa is one of Africa's strongest economies.
Ever since BRICS grouping has been established, the intra-trade has grown, but also bilateral trade has grown. I think that indicates not a talk shop.
Some predict that BRICS could overtake the G7 by 2035. But Brazil and Russia are slowly crawling out of recession, and fast-rising populations in some of the BRICS nations could sabotage their ability to develop. China's economy alone is larger than the rest of the BRICS combined. Does its dominance mean it can use the alliance for its own ends? In June of this year, India and China began a military standoff in Doklam, a disputed region in the Himalayas. The conflict has ended, but some believe the damage could be long-lasting. So can BRICS play the global role to which it aspires?
The notion that these countries, the BRICS, would take on the kind of role the U.S. had once played, those were a fantasy.
Will BRICS overtake the G7? Or can the Western powers maintain their position as the leading global economic forces? And will conflicting interests between the countries actually be the end of BRICS? For today's Roundtable, we're joined from Moscow via Skype by Georgy Toloraya, former Russian minister, now executive director of the Russian National Committee on BRICS Research. At the Roundtable here, physically with me, the author and columnist Inderjeet Parmar. We also have Dr. Hongbo, a reader in financial economics from SOAS University in London, and Professor Anthony Pereira. He's from the Brazil Institute at King's College, London. Thank you all very much indeed. You know so much more about this than I do, and I hope to be better informed by the end of this programme. So I'm going to start off, first of all, let's go to Moscow, Georgy, and the question for each one of you is, from Russia's point of view, and it'll be India and China and Brazil in a minute, from Russia's point of view, what is the point of BRICS?
Well, the point of BRICS is to change the global financial architecture, and not only the financial architecture, but also the global governance system, in a way that it should become more balanced, more taken into account the interests of emerging markets and developing the developing nations.
Anthony, from Brazil's point of view, would you say that's a fair representation of that country's?
Up to a point. I think it's what the BRICS are good at articulating is what they don't want. They don't want a unipolar world. They don't want a system that's not rules-based in which the stronger countries can violate the rules whenever they feel like it. They want multipolarity. Where I think they don't articulate a vision so well is what they want in terms of a positive project. And we've seen over the last 8 or 9 years moments in which the BRICS countries could have presented a common front, and they weren't able to. For example, when the decision was made about who's going to be the new leaders of the IMF and the World Bank. That's just one example. But it's more difficult for them, I think, to converge on common positions because they are so different.
And China growing so rapidly, Dr. Bo, does it have a different agenda to the one that we've just heard outlined?
Yes, I think it's Chinese people or the Chinese government looks BRICS as a mechanism or channel through which the voice of emerging markets is heard by the developed markets. And in addition, I think China is going to use this platform to show the other side of the world that the Chinese way of Chinese model of capitalism can be very effective.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. I mean, you know, we are here, we are important, we want you to hear us, and we don't think the rest of the world should be run by other people. From India's point of view, if that's the same, has it worked?
Well, it's working to a degree. It's raised its profile. It suggests there's a kind of new position in the world order in which it wants to occupy. But I think you have to remember that it was Goldman Sachs which invented the BRICS. And in a way, if you look back to the 1970s and the challenge from the third world for a new international economic order, then what you can see there is that it wasn't really a challenge against the powers that be. It was an attempt to get into the top table of world power as well. And I think that's what India basically wants. So it's not a challenger to the world system. It's an extension of it. And what India is looking for is investment. It's looking to invest abroad. They're looking to increase trade and its GDP. But it sits atop a very unequal system. And it doesn't really offer a vision which is very different from what the international system as a whole historically has offered either.
So the point here, Georgy, from Inderjeet, is that it may have said what it wants, but it hasn't actually been able to change very much at all. So from Russia's point of view, where do you think it's gone?
I think that BRICS is not a purely economic project, because BRICS countries are, this is tyranny of distances. They're far away from each other. They don't have the big integration agenda. But the matter is that they share the same views on the global political process, and it's much the process which is initiated by the elites, political elites of these countries, to be more relevant in international affairs, to have more say in them.
Okay, so Russia's had a tough time economically, so too Brazil recently. Is Brazil's position entirely different from that of the two major powers in this, which we might call India and China, and Brazil lagging far behind with a different agenda?
I think they're similar agendas. I mean, I think one of the most exciting things the BRICS have been able to do is create the new development bank. So that's funding infrastructure.
Which is its version, if you like, of the World Bank.
Yeah. And I think Inderjeet's point is well made. If there had been more reform at the World Bank and the IMF in terms of the voting rights, they might not have felt the need to create their own new development bank. But I think Brazil's position is probably quite similar to those other two countries you mentioned, in that it wants investment. It doesn't save enough. I mean, in this case, it's quite different from China. It doesn't save enough. It needs foreign investment. It needs to integrate into the world capitalist economy. And in fact, it's applied now to the OECD. Which doesn't reflect a radically alternative strategy. It reflects one in which it wants to align investors.
Is Brazil's position, and you can jump in on this because it involves the other countries as well, one of needing to be part of this because it needs to trade with other countries rather than trying to specifically change the world?
I think from the Brazil perspective, the trade relationship with China is key. That's the #1 commercial partner that it has. That's where a lot of its commodities go. And that's one of the main drivers of staying within BRICS and valuing BRICS.
How's it working out between China and India with the territorial disputes, right, the two massive economies both competing against one another? How's it worked out that way?
Well, I think it's quite clear that India and China have a number of shared interests, but they do have a large number of disputes between them as well. And to my mind, it's interesting that the United States has begun to refer to the Asia-Pacific as the Indo-Pacific recently. And I think that suggests that in the global sort of vision of the United States, which remains with Donald Trump in office as well, India plays a particular role, and that is a counterbalancer of China. Somebody which is going to be more closely allied and working with Australia and with Japan, and it therefore joins that kind of ring of steel, which I think the United States wants to do. And I think India is very willingly able to do that. And so they're going to be buying a lot more arms, and they're going to be prepared to play a larger strategic role in West Asia, Afghanistan, in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, and even in East Asia.
We'll get the
so
Chinese perspective.
when we look at the BRICS, we've got to look at them in that kind of geopolitical context too. And there, I think there are quite a number of rivalries. Whether they can be overcome and negotiated is a different question, but there are several rivalries there which need to be analysed as well.
I would like to ask you the same question in just a minute, but I saw Georgy in Moscow nodding in agreement or nodding in frustration, I don't know which it was, as Inderjeet was making his point. What did you want to say?
Well, I wasn't exactly in agreement, but you're right that the BRICS has a lot of internal tensions. And the Indo-China rivalry, which has already become, well, much more pronounced than it was before the BRICS was set up, is a major factor. The thing is, however, that both India and China has common interests and has divergent interests. And common interests, as well as other BRICS countries, they can be well defended and promoted by the BRICS mechanism. So regardless of what happens between the two countries, they are not ready to drop the BRICS mechanism, and they use it for their own national interests. And that's the essence of BRICS.
Okay.
We might disagree on certain things, we may have conflicts on certain things, but we have common interests and global aim, which justifies the existence and activities of BRICS.
There's friction at the moment, and that's historically, there always has been, between India and China. But can the two coexist when you have such a massive manufacturing base in China and you have such a, let's say, a service industry that is massive in India with the IT business?
Yeah.
Or is it likely to spill over?
Actually, that is the point that I'm going to make. I think don't forget about the economic competition between India and China. And China has done a lot of work in the past 30 years also. But now I think it's the chance for India to catch up with China. So from this point of view, yes, there are some political differences, border issues, but I think they do have some rivalry in terms of the economic power.
But that can be put to one side?
Yes, but I think they have to sit down, they work together, because as you said that, China is very good at manufacturing sector, and India is actually very good in IT service sector. So I think and China is actually going into that direction. So I think they have something that they can compensate with each other if they solve the other issues in a out way, let's say.
You know what we haven't mentioned so far? South Africa. Okay, nobody here particularly understands necessarily the specifics of what's happening in South Africa. So my question is it an irrelevance? Was it invited along to the party simply because it was a representative, if you like, of the massive African continent, or perhaps because countries such as China have a huge interest in what goes on in Africa? Who wants to pick that one up?
I would just say from the Brazilian perspective, I think they fully support it, including South Africa, because the Brazilians see their own role in Africa as quite important. They feel that they have cultural affinities with Africa. They have a presence, especially in Lusophone Africa, Portuguese-speaking Africa. And I think they supported it because they've made a big diplomatic push in recent years, creating embassies in African countries that they didn't previously have.
So this is for sphere of influence purposes?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
And the same with China.
I think China likes that idea that South Africa should be a member in that bloc, in the sense that China has had quite a lot of economic interest in Africa in general.
And growing. I mean, it's like all the time.
Since 2005, I think people were talking about China are investing in infrastructure in African countries, etc., etc. So I think China has already had some connection with South Africa.
Inderjeet, I'll come to you in just a moment. Let me ask Georgy, from the Russian perspective, is South Africa relevant to all of this, or is it perhaps something that China, Russia, India, Brazil all want to exploit, if you could put it that way?
For Russia, it's very important because you know that Soviet Union was quite active in Africa, and from the point of view, well, national liberation movement and anti-imperialistic struggle. We're no longer there, but as a result, we've lost almost all the positions in Africa, and we're interested in developing a relation with this fast-growing continent. And South Africa presents a very good opening to the whole of African continent, and thanks to BRICS, our relations with South Africa and, well, all the countries south of Sahara have been activated, which is good both for the Russian positions and for the global economy.
Inderjeet, compared to some of the economies that we're talking about, and specifically the Russian, the Indian, the Chinese economies, South Africa is, let me put it this way, it's not healthy, it's not growing at the same rate, there's high levels of corruption. So why is South Africa, well, let me put it this way, what has South Africa contributed?
Well, I think in terms of corruption, it contributes its fair share to the entire BRICS sort of concept. I don't think it's any less corrupt. I think it's, what Georgy said is probably correct. It's a base of operations. It's seen as an engine of growth. And when we look at the behavior of the BRICS corporations, or corporations that come from the BRICS countries, their behavior in Africa is just the way it was when the scramble for Africa in the 1890s by the West was taking place. That is, they are basically exploiting that place in order to invest in it, to extract from it as much as possible. Chinese companies hardly employ African labor if they can help it. Indian companies are exploiting that continent too. So I don't see that there is any alternative vision which is being offered here. What we have is 5 countries who then sometimes they tack on Mexico and Indonesia to themselves as well, and maybe other countries, the sort of middle-level countries, and they basically are trying to sort of have some kind of a leverage in the international system with some kind of faint threat that they are challenged to it, but actually they're in a creation of it and an extension of it.
As the non-expert,
and even their principles are not particularly different from what has occurred in the international system generally since 1945.
I'm learning a lot. As the non-expert at this table and via Skype, I'm sort of getting the sense that most of you seem to think this is about self-interest rather than global interest.
All the countries have their national interests, sometimes confronting each other. And the principle of BRICS is total equality and consensus. So obviously this lowest denominator is not very high. But there are certain interests that are common for the countries, and they're pursued best together than one by one. And that's what makes BRICS tick.
I think sometimes just the presence of new actors in world politics, even though their motivation is not radical in terms of transformation, can change global politics to some extent. It can make it multipolar. It can make it so that it's not the US, not the Europeans that are calling the shots. So, for example, if the new development bank, as it says it will, starts to fund projects outside of the 5 members of the BRICS countries, and perhaps does that on slightly different terms, maybe pushes alternative energy, does it in a way differently from the IMF and the World Bank, then we might see some people saying, well, you know, this isn't a radical group, but it's one that's reforming the global system.
And they're talking about massive
ways.
infrastructure projects, aren't they?
Yes, they have quite a bit of capital.
Tell me about the ones in China.
Yes, I think, people often say that, you know, it is imbalance even within the bloc, BRICS. So, for example, some countries are probably are poor in the sense that they do not have finance for infrastructure, and I think this is natural for China because China has built up a lot of experiences in terms of infrastructure investment overseas. So I think the bank, the New Development Bank, maybe they have different regulations in terms of lending. However, I think I think they have to follow the market in the first instance. They have to make money to get the rate of return of investment in the first instance. And then I think they are trying to promote the development of other developing markets, developing economies.
Infrastructure in India, I mean, it's changing rapidly. But something like this could transform India in 2 decades, couldn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, don't get me wrong, I'm a supporter of infrastructure investment and development, so-called, but very often the strategies which are used, even though they may be slight differences of emphasis and possibly, green energy or whatever it might be, the fact remains, the point that you made is correct, that these people are looking for a return.
Yes.
And what that basically means is the distribution of the goods produced is highly unequal. And that's why, if you look at every one of these BRICS states, we see their economies and their societies are deeply unequal and getting more so. In the last 20 years or so, and particularly since the collapse of the Soviet bloc, that has been the case. And Thomas Piketty has just published a paper on Indian inequality, for example. And that top 1% is like any 1% in the world. It's getting richer.
But so is the Indian middle class. I mean, that is changing rapidly.
Indian middle class is very, very brittle. It's very small, probably 80 million out of a population which exceeds now 1 billion. That is a deeply unstable system. And I think that when you look at the BRICS and the sort of so-called alternative they may be offering, sure, they're a new actor in the world. To some extent, they do democratize, and maybe there is a nod toward multipolarity. But when you look at the underlying infrastructure of world power, financial and economic, the dollar, who's challenging the dollar? Even the Asian Development Bank is bigger than the New Development Bank.
Georgy, do you think it's changed the world?
Well, you're right to say that even the presence of the new actors and a consolidated group of actors is changing the rules, actually. And that's the purpose of BRICS, to turn from rule takers to rule makers. And there are 2 ways to do this. Either to create a parallel structure of governance, like New Development Bank versus IMF and World Bank, but this has had limited effect. And the other one is to improve its own position in the existing global governance system and create new areas where BRICS can take a much more prominent role, like internet, global commons. There's a proliferation of military drones these days, and they're not regulated by any international agreement. So why not BRICS cannot well take the initiative to create some kind of regulation for this particular area?
Is it going to be realigned to some extent, that the relevance, let's say, and I'm not picking on Brazil here, the relevance of Brazil in an organization such as this may wane, that other countries will come in and you will see a loose affiliation rather than something that is permanent and likely to last a long time? Anthony, your thoughts?
I mean, I think it could get looser. I mean, the current government in Brazil is actually quite ambivalent about BRICS. So we had 14 years of Workers' Party rule, a center-left government in Brazil. And that ended when there was an impeachment of the president in 2016. And up until about 3 or 4 years ago, you could have said that Brazil actually was quite effective in reducing poverty and even reducing, to some extent, modestly, income inequality. But because of the recession and because of this new government's austerity approach, that has ended. So we're now getting rising levels of inequality. And it's also very hostile to the South-South rhetoric of the Workers' Party government. So it is saying we don't want South-South. We want to embrace the traditional actors in world. So I think Brazil is an example, and I don't know if this is seen in any of the other member countries, of a government, the current government, that's quite ambivalent about being associated.
Let me just ask you, if you don't mind, Dr. Bo, to sort of wrap some of this up, because China's the biggest economy involved in this. And I wonder if there's a way that China, you think, sees BRICS developing and changing.
Yes, I see BRICS is going to doing better in the next 10 years as compared to the last 10 years. The reason is mainly the changing international environment for developing economies. So for example, when the bloc was established, the environment was, the American system was very different from now. So now China, in terms of the Chinese government, they see quite a lot of opportunities. For example, climate change, issues. For example, Xi Jinping now is much more powerful than 10 years ago, than 5 years ago. So therefore, I think in terms of the global governance, I think there are quite a lot of opportunities for the Chinese government. And in terms of people talking about inequality within their own country, I think if you are a member in the bloc, that can be functioning as an external monetary mechanism.
We're going to have
for,
to continue,
for the country.
continue
so
this conversation once we've gone off air, which we have sadly come to the end of our time on Roundtable. And forgive me for this, I suppose if you look at BRICS, it's always the foundations that keep BRICS strong. But at least there is a conversation going on. What happens in the next few years, we will have to wait and see. To all my guests here and in Moscow, thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Roundtable. We'll be back pretty soon with another show from me, David Foster, and the team. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.